His Innocent Sin, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Girl in the Kitchen. Rain had soaked the streets into a mirror of themselves. Reflections of red traffic lights bled across the pavement as Adrian Moretti pulled his coat tighter against the wind. The Rossi brownstone stood quiet, its windows dim. From the outside it looked like every other brick shell on the block. Respectable, lived in, forgettable. He liked that about it. Ordinary places had a way of hiding the most extraordinary things. He hadn't meant to come inside. He was only here to return Luca's phone, left behind at a meeting that had run too long and ended with too many hands shaken under too many false pretenses. Adrian had intended to drop it off, send a curt text, and leave. But the door was unlocked, the entry light dimmed, and a warm scent drifted from the kitchen. Honey, vanilla, something just this side of burnt. He stepped in without thinking, his leather soles soundless against the old wooden floor. And then he saw her. Emilia. She was alone, barefoot, a worn t-shirt clinging damp to her back, sleeves hanging past her wrists as she moved around the kitchen without rhythm. A record crackled softly from a turntable in the corner, an old jazz vinyl that gave the room a strange, dreamlike texture. She was dancing, not well, not for anyone, just enough to sway her hips and turn on the balls of her feet, laughing softly to herself as she fumbled with a dripping spoon. The fridge stood open, casting a pale glow across her skin. Her hair was up, messily pinned, strands escaping to stick to the curve of her neck. She reached into a jar, dipped a finger into something golden, and brought it to her lips. He should have walked away. Instead, Adrian stood in the darkened hallway, breath-stilling. It wasn't lust that rooted him in place, not at first. It was the stillness she carried, the softness that seemed immune to the cold of the world outside. There was no performance in her, no weapon. She didn't know she was being watched, and because of that, she was entirely real, entirely hers. He hadn't seen her in years. Not since she left for university with a duffel bag and the same cracked phone she refused to replace. She had been younger then, girlish, and unsure. This was different. She had grown into herself without asking permission, and he couldn't look away. Adrian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the sound faint but sharp in the quiet. Emilia turned at once, spoon in hand, eyes blinking wide before her expression eased into something almost amused. "You scared me," she said, brushing a curl from her cheek. "You're not exactly subtle." He stepped out of the shadows with practiced calm, though the moment felt oddly intimate, as if he had intruded on something sacred. Door was open. She arched a brow. "It's New York. They're always open when you forget to check. You live alone now." Luca crashes sometimes when he's not pretending he doesn't still sleep with a bat under his bed. She moved with the ease of someone who didn't yet know the weight she carried in a man's mind. Adrian watched the way she poured something into a mug, the small tremble in her fingers she probably didn't even notice. Her nails were chipped, pale polish wearing off at the edges. "Coffee at midnight?" he asked. "Chamomile," she corrected. "Helps with the insomnia." He nodded but said nothing, taking in the mismatched mugs, the half-finished crossword on the counter, the paint peeling slightly near the window. The Rossi home was not like his own. There were imperfections here, lived-in messes and old wood creaking in the silence. It made him uneasy, this warmth. It also made him want to stay. She handed him a mug, not asking if he wanted it. He took it. For a long moment they said nothing. She sipped her tea. He watched the steam curl between them. Outside, the rain softened into a whisper. "I heard you're running things now," she said finally, voice low. "I'm managing them," he replied. "Managing, that's a very sterile word for what you do." He didn't flinch, she didn't press, and instead, she leaned against the counter and studied him, as though trying to read something behind his eyes. Her gaze wasn't naive. Curious, yes, but not naive. "You always looked like you were carved out of marble," she said softly. "But you're not, are you?" He didn't answer, Her words hung between them like a match before the strike. "I'm glad you're here," she added, quieter now. "Even if you weren't invited." That admission landed sharper than it should have. He had heard similar words from women before, spoken with practiced breathlessness in velvet lounges, but never like this. Never without performance. Never from her. Adrian stepped closer. Not enough to touch, but enough to change the air between them. He saw her chest rise slightly, the subtle shift of her shoulders. She didn't move back, but he did. "I'll leave your brother's phone on the table," he said, setting it down. She didn't argue. At the door, he paused. She had already returned to the fridge, humming under her breath, unaware of the chaos she'd ignited inside him, or maybe not unaware at all. As he stepped back into the wet, quiet street, Adrian realized something with a slow, steady certainty. He wouldn't be able to stay away, not now, not after this. And if anyone tried to take this from him, this warmth, this softness, this girl who had smiled at him like he wasn't dangerous, he would become the very thing she didn't yet understand him to be. Chapter 2. Her Little Secrets. The next morning, Adrian was in his office before the sun had fully risen. He hadn't slept. The rain had stopped sometime around 3, leaving the city slick and hushed, the skyline bruised with early light. His suit was immaculate, as always, but something beneath it had come undone. The memory of her lingered in places he didn't expect. The faint trace of honey in his coffee. The ghost of warmth in the curve of his palm where she'd placed the mug. He opened a file on his desk and stared at it for 27 minutes without turning a single page. Across the city, Emilia Rossi's name had started moving up the priority tiers of his surveillance lists, quietly, without alerting the men who worked beneath him. It wasn't about control. It wasn't even about curiosity. It was something far less rational, far more dangerous. He needed to know the shape of her days, where she walked, what she smiled at, who she let too close. She didn't belong in the parts of the world he inhabited. And yet, she had looked so natural standing barefoot in the kitchen, offering him tea without a flicker of fear. That absence of fear disturbed him more than anything else. Not because she was wrong to trust him, but because she wasn't. She should have been afraid. Instead, she'd smiled at him like a girl who thought monsters lived in storybooks. By mid-afternoon, he was in the back seat of his black sedan, trailing one car length behind her without needing to look up from his screen. She hadn't seen him, of course. He kept a respectful distance, but she was easy to find, predictable almost. A bookstore on 5th, a short walk to a cramped cafe with mismatched chairs and a cracked window that someone had tried to repair with tape. Then a stop at a corner flower stand where she stood too long trying to choose between dahlias and ranunculus. She bought neither, just watched the petals sway and walked on. Adrian didn't follow her home. He already knew the way. Instead, he waited in the alley across from the cafe and lit a cigarette he wouldn't finish. The last time he'd smoked, he was 19 and covered in blood. It tasted the same now, sharp and dry like regret. The next evening, fate, or something else that knew the shape of obsession, pulled them together again. Luca called and said they were doing dinner at home. Emilia was cooking. Adrian was expected. "You like lasagna, right?" Luca asked over the phone, half distracted. "She makes it the way Mom used to, you remember?" Adrian said nothing for a moment. "I'll be there." He arrived just after 8, bringing a bottle of wine he didn't plan to open. The brownstone was warm with light this time, music playing low from somewhere inside. Not jazz this time, something older. French. A woman's voice drifting like silk through the air. Emilia opened the door barefoot again, the same oversized sweater, a different color. Her hair was tied up messily, strands curling around her cheekbones. Her smile wasn't surprised. "You're on time," she said. "Unusual?" She tilted her head. "For you, yes." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped inside, the familiar scent of garlic and tomato brushing past him like an old memory. The house felt smaller than it had the last time he'd been here with Luca. Younger, more lived in. There were half-burned candles on the table, a forgotten sock under the radiator, and a sticky note on the fridge that read, "Don't touch. It's for Adrian," in her handwriting. The evening unfolded slowly, without ceremony. Luca, half-drunk and talking too loudly, dominated the conversation. Emilia moved between the kitchen and the table with casual grace, her elbow brushing Adrian's shoulder each time she passed. If she noticed, she didn't show it. If he noticed, he said nothing. But the heat of each touch stayed glowing beneath the skin long after she was gone. At one point she dropped a spoon, bent to pick it up, and when she rose, their eyes caught, briefly too long, and something passed between them, something unspoken and sharp, and perilously close to familiar. She looked away first. Later, after Luca had passed out on the couch with a half-finished beer on his chest, Emilia walked Adrian to the door. "You're always quiet," she said softly. "It's a habit." She nodded. Then, without looking at him, "You've been watching me." The words didn't come as accusation. They hung in the air like fog, dense and uncertain, soft at the edges. He said nothing. Silence was his armor, but in that moment, it felt thinner than usual. "I don't mind," she added. "I just wonder what you see." He didn't answer. Couldn't. Because if he started speaking, he might say too much. That he saw the way she hummed to herself when she cooked. That he knew she carried pepper spray but never checked if it was full. That the world had already started curling around her like she was something to be taken, and he would not allow that to happen. Not ever. Instead, he reached past her and opened the door. Cold air spilled in, brushing their skin. "Good night, Emilia." She didn't answer until he'd stepped outside. Then, almost too soft to hear, "You don't have to protect me, Adrian." He paused on the step just long enough for her to close the door behind him. But it was too late for that now. He was already doing it, and it had nothing to do with duty, or Luca, or honor. It had everything to do with the way her absence clung to him now like scent on skin. Faint, persistent, impossible to wash away. Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. The day after the dinner, Adrian found himself back in the private corner of his club, where no one dared to interrupt him without a reason worth bleeding over. The curtains were drawn shut. Soft lighting poured gold across the empty glass in front of him, untouched, the rim marked faintly from where his hand had hovered. There were papers waiting for his signature, names waiting for his order, debts owed in silence. But he read none of it. His focus drifted, pulled relentlessly back to her. It wasn't just what she said, it was what she didn't. She hadn't asked about his work, hadn't pressed for explanations. She hadn't tiptoed around him or forced brightness where it didn't belong. Emilia had simply stood there, honest and unguarded, asking nothing and offering presence in return. He wasn't used to it. Most people looked at him and saw power, utility, leverage. She looked and saw something else. Something he didn't fully recognize, but feared she might one day name. By evening, he was parked 3 buildings down from hers, hidden by the curve of the street. A magazine sat untouched in the passenger seat. Rain slid down the windshield in silent trails. She hadn't drawn her curtains. She was in her room, lights on low, hair damp and falling loose over her shoulders. He could only see the outline of her figure, the shift of movement as she pulled a sweater over her head, walked barefoot to the window and paused. For a second he thought she was looking at him. The stillness of her posture, the way she tilted her head, it was too deliberate, too direct. But then she stepped away, out of sight, and the shadow disappeared behind the frame. He left the car running and drove to the river. There was something about the water that made him feel less human, watching it move in constant, indifferent current, as if it didn't care how many bodies it had swallowed. He thought of the men he'd made disappear, of the night Luca had nearly died, and Adrian had painted a hotel room red to keep him breathing. That had been the first time someone had looked at him differently afterward. Not with fear, but awe. Emilia would look at him differently too eventually. She had to. That softness wouldn't survive what he was, but a part of him, the part buried deepest beneath the ash and concrete, didn't want her to change. The next time they saw each other was accidental, or at least it could have passed for it. Emilia was carrying groceries up the narrow stairs to her apartment, arms full and keys jammed between her teeth. Adrian had just stepped out of his car to walk into the tailor shop next door, but when he saw her struggling, something pulled his feet in a different direction. He didn't offer help. He simply took the bags from her arms without a word and followed her up. She didn't act surprised to see him, just stepped aside and let him in, the scent of citrus and clean laundry lingering in the air around her. The apartment was small, lived in, cluttered in a charming sort of way. Books stacked on every flat surface, blank notebooks arranged in a precarious tower, a cat-shaped mug filled with pens. Adrian's eyes passed over it all with clinical precision, memorizing the exits, the blind spots, the weak points in the window locks. Emilia dropped her keys in a bowl by the door, then turned, arms crossed loosely over her chest. "Are you always this quiet? Or is it just around me?" His gaze drifted to a framed photo on the wall. Her, younger, with Luca, both sunburnt and smiling too widely. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he asked, "You always leave your curtains open?" "Only when I forget they exist." He let that sit. She moved toward the kitchen, taking 2 glasses from the cupboard. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It wasn't even charged in the usual way. It felt more like the space before a match is struck, a pause so still it begins to buzz. "You know," she said, pouring water, "you don't have to hover." "I'm not hovering." "You've been at the corner cafe every day this week, same table, no coffee. Just a book you never read, and a seat with a perfect view of my door." Her back was still turned when she said it, and when she finally looked over her shoulder, there was no fear in her eyes, only recognition. Adrian didn't flinch. "You kept count." "I noticed." She set the glasses down. Neither of them moved toward them. "I don't know what you're trying to protect me from," she said after a moment, quieter now. "Or if it's even about that. But you don't need to pretend this is all some brotherly concern." He stepped forward then, closing the space between them by degrees. Not quickly, not aggressively. Just enough to feel the shift in her breath. "I'm not pretending," he said. Her chin tilted up slightly, eyes locked to his, but he didn't touch her, didn't kiss her. Instead, he stepped back. Whatever this was between them, it was too exposed here, too unguarded. And he knew how easily desire could become ruin. He had seen it firsthand, had watched men throw away their power, their reason, their lives for softness. He wasn't built for softness. But she made him want it anyway. He left without drinking the water. Later that night, when the house was dark and still, Emilia walked to the window and looked out toward the street below. The same spot. No car, but she stood there anyway, just in case. Chapter 4. The first line crossed. The storm began before sunset. It had rolled in from the Atlantic all afternoon, bloated and heavy, the air thick with the scent of ozone and waiting. By the time the first thunderclap rattled the sky, the street lamps had blinked on early, their glow dim against the thick curtain of rain. Adrian hadn't planned to be there. He never planned these visits, at least not in the traditional sense, but the Rossi brownstone had a way of drawing him in when the rest of the world frayed at the edges. It was a quiet gravity, almost innocent in the way it pulled. That night, it brought him to Luca's door with the excuse of reviewing business ledgers, as if either of them actually cared about numbers when the storm outside was bending trees sideways. Luca had barely lasted an hour. He left in his usual rushed way, something about a girl uptown and a bottle of whiskey with his name on it. Adrian didn't argue. He simply watched his friend disappear into the downpour, the door swinging shut behind him with a damp gust of air. Emilia was upstairs. He knew because the floor creaked above him, soft, uneven steps, the kind that marked bare feet. The lights flickered once, then steadied. A drop of water hit the window, followed by another. Then the sound came in sheets, A clean, relentless downpour hammering the glass. The power blinked again, then failed completely. Silence, then the low, unmistakable hiss of rain claiming the world outside. Adrian stayed still in the living room, his hands resting on the arms of the worn leather chair. Shadows stretched across the walls, flickering faintly from the candles Emilia had lit before Luca left. Small flames that danced without pattern, as if unsure whether to stay alive. A moment later she appeared on the stairs, a blanket draped over her shoulders, curls falling loose down her back. She didn't startle at the sight of him sitting there. If anything, her gaze softened, as though she'd expected him to remain. "No power," she said unnecessarily. He nodded once, eyes on her, waiting. She moved to the couch and sat cross-legged, folding the blanket tighter around her like a shield, though it was already slipping off one shoulder. The room smelled like rain and melted wax. Her skin had that flushed look it got when she was warm, but not uncomfortable. Just settled, at ease. For a while, neither of them spoke. The storm filled the silence well enough. It roared and whispered in turns, distant thunder echoing like breath across the bones of the house. He watched her, the firelight painting flickers across her face, catching on the slope of her cheek, the curve of her mouth. She wasn't looking at him directly, but she wasn't avoiding him either. It was a kind of suspended awareness, like both of them were pretending not to be exactly where they were. When she did speak, it was low, nearly drowned by the rain. "Do you ever stop holding your breath?" He didn't answer immediately. Her words were too precise to be careless. "I don't notice that I do." She glanced at him then fully, a flicker of something unreadable behind her eyes. "I think you've been holding it since the moment you walked in here." "I don't hold my breath for danger." "That's not what I said." The air in the room shifted then. Not loudly, not with drama, but with the kind of quiet precision that real changes always come with. She unfolded her legs, the blanket slipping further, pooling at her waist. Her bare foot touched the floor, then the other. She stood slowly, walked across the short space between them, and stopped in front of his chair. Adrian didn't move, and he thought she might say something. She didn't. She simply reached down and touched the side of his face, her fingers barely grazing his jaw. It wasn't bold. It wasn't even certain. It was just there. That was all it took. He stood. The space between them vanished in an instant, yet nothing happened quickly. His hands hovered at her waist but didn't land. Her breath caught but didn't escape. For a moment they were suspended, not in hesitation, but in reverence, as though neither of them wanted to shatter whatever strange tether had been forming in the dark. Then she moved first, just a fraction forward, her forehead brushing his chest, her palms flat against the front of his shirt. His arms closed around her without thought, one hand at her lower back, the other at the nape of her neck. Her body fit against him like it had always known how to. It wasn't hunger that passed between them, not at first. It was something softer, slower, like they were discovering a language with their bodies that neither of them had spoken before but somehow already understood. When he finally lowered his mouth to hers, it was cautious, reverent, like a man praying for something he had no right to ask for. Her lips parted beneath his, not desperate, but willing. And that more than anything undid him. The kiss was slow. It deepened, gradually, then all at once. A shift in pressure, a tilt of her head, the whisper of breath caught between mouths. He felt her hands curl into his shirt, felt the quiet tremble in her fingers. Not fear, something else. The same thing that had been building between them for weeks in silence and half-held glances. He pulled back only when he had to, when the air between them felt like too much and not enough all at once. Her eyes were closed for a moment, her lashes dark against her skin. Then they opened, and she looked up at him like she had known this would happen all along. He hadn't. Not like this. Not with her standing so close, asking nothing, promising nothing, just being, real, unguarded, and ruinously near. He stepped back first, because he had to, because any closer, and he wouldn't remember how to stop. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, and she didn't argue. And that made it worse. She just stood there in the glow of candlelight, lips slightly parted, the blanket forgotten on the floor. She looked like a memory he hadn't made yet, one he would never be able to erase. Outside, the storm continued without pause. Inside, the silence said everything he couldn't. Chapter 5. Every god has teeth. The kiss stayed with him longer than it should have. Adrian carried it like a hidden wound, not bleeding, but always there beneath the surface, aching quietly in moments of stillness. It had settled in the softest part of him, a place he had long thought stripped bare by time and blood. And now it bloomed, inconveniently and without mercy, in the space between self-control and surrender. He kept his distance after that night, at least in the obvious ways. No doorstep visits, no late-night drop-ins or manufactured excuses to see her. But his absence was a hollow performance. He still knew where she was every day, every hour. Emilia moved through the city in the slow, unbothered rhythm of someone who had no idea she was being followed. She kept her keys in her bag instead of her hand. She wore headphones while walking at night. She smiled at strangers. He started carrying 2 phones again, one for business, one that lit up only with updates about her. Location pings, camera stills, a list of names she interacted with longer than 5 minutes. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something darker, more primal. An ache sharpened by restraint. He had tasted something forbidden, and instead of sating him, it had split him open. The worst part was how unchanged she seemed, as if nothing had happened, as if that kiss hadn't rearranged the chemistry of the air between them. But that was Emilia, composed on the surface, chaos underneath. He didn't know if her calm was a mask or simply her nature, but it made him feel less in control than he liked. He began dreaming of her, not of her body, not exactly, though that too lived in the corners of his mind. No, the dreams were stranger, quieter. He'd see her in a bookstore, fingers tracing spines of poetry volumes. He'd see her standing in the rain, lips parted like she was about to ask him something. He'd wake with her name in his throat and sweat along his collar. Then came the man in the blue jacket, and it started with a photo. She was leaving a quiet bar just before dusk, stepping out into the soft, purpling light of a New York spring evening, her face tilted slightly upward, distracted, content. He was 2 steps behind her, tall, unthreatening, well-dressed in a forgettable way, a polite hand at the small of her back. They paused at a street corner. She laughed at something. He leaned in, too close. She didn't step away. Adrian stared at the image long enough that his cigarette burned itself down to the filter between his fingers. He hadn't even lit it. By morning, he had a name, Ethan Varnell. 30 mid-level architecture firm, no criminal affiliations, no known ties to any family. Just a man, clean, dull, harmless. But he'd touched her. That was enough. Adrian didn't go to him, not directly. That wasn't his way. Instead, he followed, a slow, deliberate echo, parking on the far side of the garage, waiting for the hum of the elevator to rise, watching Ethan step out alone, humming to himself, utterly unaware. Adrian approached only once a week later in a parking structure washed in shadow and fluorescent light. No words, just a silent walk past, a brief glance that held too long, an almost smile that meant everything and nothing. The message landed. Ethan didn't show up in any more photos. Adrian didn't tell Emilia. He didn't know her that. Or perhaps he did. He wasn't sure anymore where the lines of honesty began and ended. He only knew that the thought of her with someone else scraped something raw inside him, something ancient, something ugly. And yet, she had every right to move freely. He had given her no promise, no claim. Still, she must have felt it, the shift. Because the next time they crossed paths, her smile didn't come as easily. It was at Luca's again. Another unplanned intersection. She was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her expression didn't change when he entered, but her posture did. Subtle, almost imperceptible. A stillness that hadn't been there before. He watched her from the doorway, hands in his pockets. There were 1,000 things he could have said. That she smelled like rosemary and something sweet. That she hadn't worn her necklace in days. That he'd had to remind himself not to imagine her hands on someone else's skin. Instead, he said nothing. She turned, finally, spoon in hand, her voice quiet but not soft. "You've been angry with me." He met her gaze. "No." "Then you've been somewhere else." That was true, in a way she would never understand. He had been inside himself, spiraling slowly through want and guilt and the relentless echo of her voice in his head. He had been in parking lots with men who didn't know how close they had come to ending. He had been in dreams he didn't ask for. "I've been busy." Her look said she didn't believe him, but she didn't push. The air between them filled with everything unsaid. And then, as if mercy bloomed in small, unexpected places, she looked down, set the spoon aside, and reached for the small radio on the windowsill. Music trickled in, something older, melancholic. She didn't speak, just leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her gaze drifting somewhere beyond him. Adrian stepped closer. Not much, just enough to feel the pull again, the quiet gravity. "You're not a ghost, Adrian," she said, not looking at him. "You don't get to haunt and vanish and expect nothing to shift." He stayed still. "I don't know what you want," she added, softer now. "Or if you even know. But if you're going to keep showing up in doorways, you should figure it out." He should have answered, but every reply he might have given would have sounded too thin, too fragile, and nothing about what he felt was fragile. He left before she could say anything else. That night he didn't go home. Instead, he drove without direction, through streets he knew too well, until the skyline bled into night. He thought of her words, of her voice, of the way she'd looked at him, not with fear, but with disappointment, which in its own way felt worse. He ended up at the warehouse, an old Moretti property, abandoned mostly, a place he kept as a reminder of what he was capable of when the leash slipped. Inside, he stood among crates of forgotten things, guns that no longer fired, ledgers no longer updated, ghosts of decisions made in darker years. The rain had started again, faint against the high windows, like the city was whispering a secret he already knew. He took out the photo of her, the one from the surveillance file. Not the kiss, not the cafe. Just her, walking down the street, eyes ahead, coat unbuttoned, hair caught in the wind, unaware, untouched. He traced her outline with his thumb once and then set it down. There was no going back now. He had crossed a line, and gods, even the cruel ones, were never known for their mercy. Chapter 6. Discovery. The storm had passed, but the city hadn't quite remembered how to breathe again. Everything still felt damp, suspended in a haze of unfinished weather. Sidewalks slick with memory, air heavy with the scent of diesel, and distant lilacs blooming too early for the season. Emilia woke late, sunlight creeping through the blinds, in thin, intrusive ribbons. Her room smelled like the candle she forgot to blow out the night before. Something floral, soft, safe. But there was something off in the way the morning unfolded. Not loud, not obvious. Just a feeling. A wrongness so quiet it almost passed as nothing. Her phone had stopped charging, the kettle wouldn't hum. When she tried to turn on the lamp in the hall, it gave a reluctant flicker, then died. The power was out again. Or maybe the wires were just tired. She didn't question it. She made toast on the stove, sat cross-legged on the couch, in one of Luca's old sweatshirts, and opened a book she'd read a dozen times. But the words didn't land. Her eyes moved, but nothing stayed. Something tugged at her. Something behind her shoulder, not quite formed. She set the book down, pulled her legs beneath her, and let her gaze drift to the window. It was strange, she thought, how often Adrian showed up and how rarely he explained anything. And stranger still how often she found herself wishing he would. Later that afternoon, Luca called. his voice distant, casual, asking if she could drop something off at the office. A folder, sealed, unlabeled. She agreed without asking questions. She always did. It was easier to ignore the quiet machinery humming beneath their lives than admit she'd always known it was there. She took the subway. The train was late. The air underground, thick with people, and overheard fragments of lives she didn't recognize. By the time she reached the building, the sky had begun to dim, shadows pooling in the crevices between towers. Adrian's office was on the top floor of a building that wore anonymity like armor. Clean lines, frosted glass, no sign on the door, just a number, and a silence that pressed against the skin. She'd only been there once before, months ago, and even then only briefly. But the place hadn't changed. It didn't feel like somewhere people worked. It felt like somewhere people waited. The assistant wasn't at the desk. The hallway was dim. She moved forward, unsure whether to knock or leave the envelope at the door. But the door wasn't closed. It stood ajar, just barely, and something about the way it hung, crooked, quiet, expectant, made her hand pause. She should have left it there. She didn't. Inside, the office was colder than she expected. Stark, elegant, masculine in the way of things designed not to feel lived in. The desk was clean. The blinds were drawn. One lamp was on, casting a halo of amber against the far wall. There was a door open behind the desk. She hadn't noticed it last time. Maybe it hadn't been open then. Maybe it hadn't existed. She stepped through before she could decide not to. The room beyond was nothing like the one she'd just left. It was windowless, fluorescent, silent in the way padded things are. The walls were lined with shelves, not of books, but of weapons, blades, guns, folders stacked high, photographs pinned with red thread crisscrossing from one to the next like a nervous system, names scrawled in sharp ink, maps traced over again and again, surveillance shots with timestamps, license plates, faces, and then near the center her own. A photo from a few weeks ago. Her, leaving the florist with nothing in her hands, her head tilted toward the sky. It wasn't the image that chilled her, it was the way the edge had been worn. Not torn, not stained, just touched. Often, like it had been carried, studied. There was no sound behind her, but she knew he was there. She turned. Adrian stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. He didn't look surprised, just tired, caught, undressed in a way he never had been before. Not physically, but utterly without defense. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence stretched, tense but not cruel. She waited for him to fill it, to offer an explanation, a warning, something to tether her back to the version of him she thought she understood. He said nothing, so she moved past him slowly, the envelope still in her hand. She left it on the desk as she passed, walked out without looking back. That night she didn't sleep. She thought about the photograph, the way it had been placed, not filed, not buried, present. She thought about the knife on the table beneath it, the way it gleamed under the artificial light. And she thought about the kiss, the way his mouth had moved against hers, not with hunger, but with reverence, as if he'd known even then that the truth was already pressing against the walls of their fragile pretense. The next morning he was waiting at her door, not in the shadows, not in the street, just there. In the clear light of day, coat unbuttoned, expression unreadable. She didn't ask why. She opened the door. He stepped inside. Neither of them moved to sit. The silence that followed was different now, no longer filled with unspoken longing, but with the quiet breath of inevitability. He spoke first. "I didn't want you to see that." Her voice didn't tremble. "Why not?" "Because you'll start looking at me like everyone else does. I'm not sure I ever looked at you the way you think." He flinched at that, a tiny shift barely visible, but she caught it. She saw the way his jaw tensed, the way his hands stayed in his pockets as if anchoring himself there. "I didn't want this," he said after a pause. "I didn't plan any of it." She believed him. That was the problem. She stepped closer, eyes on his, unblinking. "Did you follow me?" "Yes." "Did you threaten someone?" He didn't answer. That too was an answer. She reached up slowly, touched the side of his face, in the same way she had the night of the storm. This time there was no surprise in her fingers, just quiet understanding. "You think I'm still innocent," she said softly, "but I'm not." He looked at her then, fully, directly, as if he couldn't lie to her with his eyes even if he wanted to. "You're the only thing I haven't ruined." The words weren't romantic, they weren't even kind. But they were the truth. And somehow that made them holy. She didn't kiss him, but she didn't step back either. The storm hadn't ended, it had just moved inside. Chapter 7. Bait. The morning was unusually warm for spring. The sun filtered in through Emilia's window like it belonged there, soft and gold, trailing across the hardwood floor in quiet patterns. She stood in the kitchen barefoot again, the sleeves of her cardigan falling over her hands as she poured coffee. The silence was ordinary, not tense, not rehearsed, just still. Adrian sat at the small table near the window watching her move. His tie was loose, jacket folded over the back of the chair. He had barely said a word since arriving, a habit she no longer questioned. Sometimes he brought the weight of other rooms with him. Sometimes it followed him like smoke. Today he felt farther away than usual. She set the mug in front of him without speaking and leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes half lowered. There were things she could have asked about the photo, the weapons, the surveillance room, about the man she'd nearly dated who'd stopped calling without warning. She could have brought any of it to the surface, but what was the point? The answers, if given, would only confirm what she already knew, that he was dangerous and that she wanted him anyway. He drank the coffee without comment. Outside, a dog barked, somewhere below the low hum of the city waking up. Everything normal, ordinary, except it wasn't. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, she walked to the bookstore. It had become part of her routine, a place where the world felt smaller, slower. The air inside always carried the scent of old pages and quiet lives. She spent 20 minutes browsing titles she'd seen before, then settled on a novel with a cracked spine and a faded cover. At the register, the clerk, a soft-voiced woman with too much eyeliner and a gentle stammer, asked if she needed a bag. Emilia declined. The book felt better in her hands. Outside, the sun had vanished behind a drift of clouds. The light had gone flat. She started home, book clutched against her chest, her thoughts elsewhere. On Adrian, on the way he'd touched her wrist that morning without thinking, as if anchoring himself in the moment before the world shifted again. She didn't notice the car until it slowed beside her. Black, windows tinted, nondescript in the way only something deliberately designed could be. She glanced over, but no window rolled down. No sound. Just a soft mechanical hum as the engine idled, then rolled forward again, disappearing around the corner. She didn't panic, not then. She took a longer route home. 3 turns she didn't need. A pause outside a bakery she had no intention of entering. Then she crossed the street and entered her building without looking back. That night Adrian didn't come and she didn't text him. She sat in bed with the book unopened on her lap and stared at the ceiling while the shadows lengthened around her. The air felt too quiet, too still, like the city was holding its breath. At exactly 2:04 a.m., the front door of the building opened. She heard it. The sound was faint, muted, the sort of thing someone else might have ignored. But she heard it. And then, nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just the click of something delicate, intentional, a soft whine of pressure shifting. She stood. Her fingers found her phone, unlocked, no missed calls, no messages. She dialed Adrian without thinking. The line rang twice before going dead. Not voicemail, not ignored. Dead. Her mouth went dry. She stepped into the hall, bare feet on the old wood, every board beneath her creaking just slightly, each sound blooming in the dark like a warning. The windows in the stairwell reflected nothing, just black glass. When she turned the corner to the second-floor landing, a figure stepped out from the shadows behind her. She didn't scream, she couldn't. A cloth pressed to her mouth. The scent, sweet, chemical, filled her lungs. Then darkness. Adrian arrived too late. The building was silent when he pulled up. No lights, no movement, just the faint electric hum of the city continuing on, indifferent. The door was unlocked. Inside, nothing looked wrong. Not at first, a jacket on the hook, an open book on the couch, the kitchen light still on, flickering faintly, her cup half full on the counter, the tea gone cold. But she wasn't there. His name broke in him like glass. He moved through the space with careful precision, checking corners, closets, windows. Every room perfectly untouched, except for the faint impression of her body on the mattress, the sheet pulled back as if she had only just risen. Then the letter, folded, tucked under the edge of the lamp on the bedside table. No handwriting, just one line typed. You brought this on yourself, come alone, midnight. A location followed, a warehouse on the East River. Familiar, owned by the Costa family. Officially abandoned, unofficially not. He stood for a long moment, the note in one hand, the other clenched tight at his side. The silence of the apartment pressed in like a second skin. Everything that mattered was gone. Taken. Not killed, not yet. The warehouse wasn't a place for killing. It was a place for decisions. For leverage. She was bait. They knew what she meant to him, and they wanted him desperate, and they wanted him unarmed. He crushed the note in his hand, and then he moved. The warehouse was older than it looked from the outside. Rust bloomed along the edges of the steel doors. Paint flaked like scabs. Inside, the air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of mildew and oil. Adrian arrived 10 minutes early. Alone, dressed in black, coat open, no weapon visible. But he was never unarmed. The lights inside flickered to life one by one, revealing a hollowed-out interior. Crates stacked along the walls, rusted catwalks overhead, shadows pooling thick near the corners. And in the center, a single chair. She was in it, tied. Not hurt, not visibly, not yet. Her head lifted slowly, eyes meeting his. There was no panic in them, only a strange, exhausted relief, as if she'd known he would come. He took one step forward, and the doors slammed shut behind him. Chapter 8. The Monster Unleashed. The air inside the warehouse was colder than it had any right to be. Not the cold of winter. That would have at least carried something human. This was deeper, older. A dead kind of cold that rose from the floor and coiled around the ribs, whispering of silence and dust and things left buried. Adrian stepped forward, slow and steady, his boots clicking faintly against the concrete. Every sound felt exaggerated in the stillness, like the building was listening, watching, waiting. Emilia sat exactly where the message had promised she would be, center of the room, tied to a metal chair, wrists bound behind her. Her head was upright, her posture unbroken, but he could see the tremor in her shoulders, the paleness around her mouth, the way her breath moved in quick, shallow bursts. Her eyes met his without hesitation. She didn't cry out, and she didn't speak, and she didn't have to. She knew, somehow she knew, that he would come. He took one step closer and then another until he stood a few feet in front of her. She was marked, but not mangled. A split lip, a bruise forming near her temple, the edge of her sleeve torn. Small cruelties. Warnings, not punishments. Not yet. He didn't touch her. Not yet. His hand stayed at his sides. Loose. Calm. He could feel his pulse in the hollow of his throat. But his face betrayed nothing. He had been trained for this, raised for this, and still none of it had prepared him for the sight of her like this. This wasn't strategy anymore, this was personal. A sound echoed from the shadows to the left, the creak of metal, the soft drag of shoes against concrete. Then a figure stepped out from behind a row of crates, clapping slowly. Beatrice Costa. She wore black like it was a religion. Long coat, gloves, heels clicking in elegant defiance of the dust around them. Her mouth was painted the same red it always was, the kind that smiled without warmth. "Well," she said, her voice echoing, "you made good time." Adrian didn't speak. She paced toward him with the lazy confidence of someone who believed she was already winning. Her hands stayed folded neatly behind her back. No gun. No threat. She didn't need one. Not yet. "We tried to keep her comfortable," she said, nodding toward Emilia. "But you know how it is. Messages get louder when you use a softer voice." His gaze didn't move from Emilia. Beatrice sighed. "Still nothing to say? No dramatic threats? No demands?" Finally he spoke. Quiet, precise. "Let her go." Beatrice tilted her head. "Oh, Adrian. That's not how this works. You know better than anyone. Leverage is leverage, and she's yours, isn't she?" Her eyes sparkled with something cruel. "That's why this works." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Behind Beatrice, more figures began to emerge, 3 men. Unarmed, visibly, but the kind who didn't need to be. They flanked her like ghosts, silent and watchful. None of them looked at Emilia. They didn't have to. She wasn't the focus. She was the fulcrum, the pressure point. Beatrice's voice dropped. "You brought her into this with your silence, with your shadows. You let her live in a world she didn't understand, and now you expect that to protect her." He looked at her then, slowly, deliberately. "Are you finished?" She smiled. "I haven't even started." But Adrian already had. The first man never saw it coming. One movement, fast, clean, and his knee shattered, sending him collapsing with a strangled cry. The second reached for his coat, too late. Adrian's elbow met his throat with a sickening crack. The third managed one step before Adrian drove his shoulder into him and sent him sprawling across the floor. It happened in seconds. Beatrice didn't flinch, not once, but her smile faltered. Adrian turned toward her slowly, blood on his knuckles, calm as winter. She reached into her coat. He didn't give her the chance, and the gun was out before she touched hers. Not a dramatic draw, no shouting. Just a clean motion, practiced and inevitable. He raised it, leveled it between her eyes, and stepped forward. "Stop," Emilia said behind him, her voice not pleading but sharp, cut through with breath. He froze. She didn't say it again. He lowered the gun. Beatrice exhaled. A quiet, bitter laugh broke from her mouth. "You're not your father," she said. "No," Adrian replied, voice ice. "He'd have shot you already." And then he turned, walked to Emilia, and knelt. No rush, no panic, just deliberate movement. His fingers found the knot behind her wrists, undone it in one swift pull. She didn't speak. Her hands were trembling. He lifted one carefully, brushed his thumb over the red mark the rope had left behind. Her skin was cold, unsteady. She leaned into him, not fully, just enough. He stood, guiding her with him, arms steady around her waist. She didn't resist. Her breathing was uneven, but she was upright, alert. Her grip on his coat was the only thing that betrayed her. No one followed them as they left. The car was parked a block away. He opened the passenger door, helped her in, and closed it gently. Inside the cabin, the silence settled between them like ash. She didn't ask what he'd done. She didn't ask if anyone was dead. She looked out the window, hands curled in her lap, then said, without turning, "I knew you'd come." He didn't answer, didn't need to. He drove in silence, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead. But something had cracked open between them. Not trust. That had already been there, in its strange, unspoken form. What cracked was the illusion. She knew who he was now, and she'd chosen not to run. Chapter 9. The Blood Within. The city didn't sleep that night. Or maybe it did. For those untouched by names whispered in back rooms, by quiet warnings exchanged behind glasses of dark liquor. But Adrian didn't sleep, and neither did Emilia. He'd brought her back to the Moretti estate not because it was the safest place, but because it was the most predictable. A fortress made of marble and old expectations, wrapped in silence and too many locks. The kind of place that had once promised power, but never comfort. She hadn't spoken much on the drive, only once when he'd reached for her hand, and she'd let him hold it. Her fingers had been cold and still slightly trembling, but she didn't pull away. Now she stood in the guest room, motionless in the open doorway, staring at the edges of a life she had never been meant to touch. There were no family photos in the Moretti house, no warm clutter, no laughter hiding in the walls. Everything had the feel of something curated, sanitized, built for appearances and not for living. Adrian watched her from the hallway, leaning against the far wall, arms crossed loosely. He hadn't changed out of his blood-stained shirt. There were smudges at the cuffs, dried specks along the collar. She said nothing about them. Instead, she turned toward him with a question in her eyes he already knew how to answer. Beatrice didn't act alone, he said. She couldn't have. Emilia stepped inside the room, then sat on the edge of the bed with slow, deliberate grace. Her shoulders curved forward, her hands clasped in her lap. It was the posture of someone who didn't want to be touched, not because of fear, but because the weight of understanding hadn't finished sinking in. You knew, she said, not accusing, just tired. I suspected. His voice was lower now, softer in a way that didn't belong in this house. But not who. The lie of loyalty had started to unravel the moment Adrian stepped out of that warehouse. The silence inside had been too clean, the retreat of the guards too orderly. Even Beatrice's posture had felt rehearsed, as if she were playing a part written by someone else. It hadn't been about power, not really. It had been about exposure. They wanted to see what he would do for her, and he had shown them. He'd made his choice openly and without hesitation. Not the family. Not the name. Her. In the morning, the message came. One of the inner circle, old, sharp-eyed, and always too careful with words, summoned Adrian back to the family compound across the river. No time was offered, no explanation, just the expectation of obedience. Emilia didn't try to stop him. She only looked up once before he turned to leave. If it's someone close to you, she said, don't let them explain. People lie better when you let them speak. He paused in the doorway, and for a moment the hard edges of him softened. He wanted to say something. Anything to give her a thread to hold on to. But he knew the moment was too fragile to dress in words. So he nodded once and left. The Moretti estate had always felt like a cathedral. Echoing halls, long shadows, devotion baked into the stone. Adrian moved through it like he had as a boy. Quiet, controlled, his face unreadable. But this time, he wasn't a son returning home. He was a threat walking into the den of his own creators. He found them waiting in the study. 3 men. 1 woman. All elders. All loyal. Or so they had claimed. And then Marco Moretti stepped into view. His father. Older now, but no less commanding. The kind of man who didn't need volume to own a room. His silence was always heavier than his presence. Sit, Marco said. Adrian didn't. His father sighed, then crossed the room slowly, pouring himself a glass of something dark. He took a measured sip before turning. You should have let her go. Adrian said nothing, and Marco looked at him like a disappointed teacher. She was leverage. You let the entire table see your hand. You exposed your weakness. I made a choice. You made a mistake. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with something more than disapproval. Adrian studied his father's face, the way the older man's jaw tightened at the edges, the cold glint in his eyes, the faint lines near his mouth. There was no grief there, no regret, only calculation. You fed her to them, Adrian said, voice low. His father didn't blink. You let them think they could reach you, that was enough. You let them take her. We had to know what you'd do. There it was. Not confession, just confirmation. You let her be taken, Adrian repeated, slower now. Because you didn't trust me. No, his father said. Because I do. And I needed you to prove it to them. The silence that followed wasn't still. It twisted, turned, settled in the bones like cold water. You made me choose between her and this family. Marco's gaze sharpened. And now you've chosen, which means you don't belong to us anymore. Adrian didn't flinch. He stepped forward once, slow and certain, then reached into his coat and placed a black ring box on the desk between them. It was old, the kind used for initiation, a sign of allegiance, worn only by those trusted with the family's deepest secrets. I never belonged, he said. Then he turned and walked away. No threats and no parting shot, just silence, and that silence spoke louder than blood. Chapter 10. All that remains. The house sat on the edge of nowhere, half swallowed by trees and wrapped in a silence that didn't feel hostile, just still. It had once belonged to someone who'd tried to live quietly and failed. There were scratches on the floorboards, long-forgotten wallpaper curling at the seams, and the faint scent of wood smoke clinging to the walls. Adrian hadn't chosen it for its beauty. He hadn't chosen it at all. It had been there, waiting, the way some places always are when a man needs to disappear. And disappear he had, from the Morettis, from the blood, from the architecture of control he'd spent his entire life upholding. There had been no argument when he left, no ceremony, just a closed door and a silence that would echo in that family for years to come. Now there was only this, a porch with peeling paint, a slanted roof, a fire that had to be coaxed into life each night, and Emilia, somewhere upstairs, humming faintly under her breath, as she unpacked the last of their things into crooked drawers. The wind moved through the trees like breath. No sirens, no black cars idling, just birdsong in the late light, and the creak of the front step as he sat, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on the gravel path that led nowhere fast. She joined him without announcement, barefoot in one of his old shirts, sleeves rolled, a mug in her hand that steamed faintly in the cool evening air. She didn't sit right away. She stood next to him, shoulder brushing his, and turned slightly to watch the same empty road. Neither of them spoke for a while. They hadn't needed to, not since the night he came back from the family compound with nothing left in his hands but her name. The world had changed quietly in that moment. Not by collapsing, just by emptying out. The sky overhead shifted into a softer blue, streaked with the last pale warmth of dusk. He could feel her looking at him, the way she always did when she thought he wouldn't notice. Not questioning, just watching. He'd once thought it was innocence that made her gaze so still. Now he knew better. It was conviction. You're not restless anymore, she said quietly. He didn't look at her, just let the words land and sit. She settled beside him, legs tucked under her, head resting lightly against his shoulder. There was no weight in the gesture, only the ease of two people who had already bled for each other and chosen to stay. He'd given up a kingdom, not just the seat at the table, but the blood oath that had stitched him into that world. He'd done it without hesitation. What surprised him most wasn't the cost. It was how little he mourned it. How the silence here felt cleaner than any power he'd ever held. Behind them, the screen door shifted on its hinge, clicking once in the wind. He remembered the first time he watched her from a hallway, dancing in the kitchen, unaware. Everything had changed in that moment, not because of what she'd done, but because he'd realized how desperately he wanted something untouched, something that didn't flinch at the monster in him. He turned to her now, fingers brushing her knee. Slow, not possessive, just present. She met his gaze, steady as always. You'd do it again, she said, not a question. He nodded once. Yes. She exhaled a quiet sound. Not relief, not fear. Just understanding. There was no ceremony to their life now. No guards. No meetings. Just the echo of the world they had left behind, humming faintly like a wound that had mostly healed. She still had questions sometimes about the things he had done, the people he had lost, the kind of man he had been before her. But she never asked all at once. She let it come slowly, like rain after drought. Never too much, always honest. And he answered piece by piece, and not to confess, but to be known. He stood stretched and held out a hand. She took it without hesitation. Together, they stepped off the porch, into the tall grass, the last light warming their faces. The path ahead was overgrown, the fence half collapsed, the road cracked and veined with time. But it was theirs. He hadn't expected this ending, hadn't even believed himself capable of one. But as she leaned into his side, her fingers laced through his, he realized it wasn't an ending at all. It was the first quiet place that hadn't asked him to choose between who he was and what he loved. And in that there was peace. Not perfect, but real. And for a man like Adrian Moretti, real had always been the rarest thing of all.